In the early months of 1803, President Thomas Jefferson sat alone in his candlelit study, staring at a map that was mostly blank. The vast territory west of the Mississippi River was a dark, whispering mystery to the young American nation. To the average citizen, this land was a terrifying void, filled with rumors of woolly mammoths, active volcanoes, and mountains made of solid salt. But to Jefferson, this blank space was the future of the United States. At the time, the strategic port of New Orleans was controlled by France, under the iron fist of Napoleon Bonaparte. Jefferson feared that if France closed the port, it would choke the life out of American trade. So he sent his trusted envoy, James Monroe, to Paris with a modest budget of $10 million to buy just the city of New Orleans. When Monroe arrived, he was met with a shocking, unbelievable offer from the French Treasury Minister. Napoleon did not just want to sell New Orleans, he wanted to sell the entire Louisiana territory. The French Emperor was facing a brutal slave revolt in Haiti and a looming war with Great Britain, and he desperately needed quick cash. For a staggering $15 million, the United States was offered 828,000 square miles of land. With the stroke of a pen, the size of the nation instantly doubled. Yet back in Washington, Jefferson faced a massive political storm. His rivals argued that the Constitution gave the president no legal authority to purchase foreign territory. But Jefferson knew this was a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity that could not be ignored. The purchase was finalized, but it created an immediate, daunting problem. The United States now owned a massive wilderness that no American had ever mapped, explored, or even seen. Spain still claimed the borders to the south and west, and British fur trappers were already encroaching from the north. Jefferson needed to secure this new empire before another European power could snatch it away. He needed someone brave enough, smart enough, and tough enough to lead a secret expedition into the absolute unknown. Jefferson turned to his private secretary, a 28-year-old former Army captain named Meriwether Lewis. Lewis was a quiet, intense man who possessed a deep knowledge of wilderness survival and botany. But Lewis knew he could not lead this perilous journey alone. He wrote a letter to his old military commander, a red-haired, charismatic leader named William Clark. Clark was an expert cartographer and a master of frontier diplomacy. When Clark received the letter, he accepted the invitation without a single moment of hesitation. Together, they began recruiting a specialized team that would become known as the Corps of Discovery. They chose rugged woodsmen, expert hunters, and tough soldiers who could survive months of isolation. They gathered heavy crates of dried food, medical supplies, and advanced scientific instruments. They also packed unique gifts for the Native American tribes they would inevitably encounter, including brass kettles, glass beads, and peace medals. But their most unusual piece of equipment was a state-of-the-art high-powered air rifle that could shoot silently. Jefferson gave Lewis strict secret instructions that went far beyond mere map-making. They were to find a continuous water route to the Pacific Ocean, which would unlock trade with Asia. They were to document every new plant, animal, and mineral they discovered along the way. Most importantly, they were to tell the native tribes that the Great Father in Washington was now their leader. In the spring of 1804, the expedition gathered at Camp Dubois near the mouth of the Missouri River. They loaded 3 heavy boats, including a massive 55-foot keelboat equipped with a sail and 22 oars. The men knew they were leaving civilization behind, with no way to send messages back home. Many people in Washington believed the men were marching straight to their deaths. On May 14, 1804, under a gray, drizzling sky, the boats pushed off into the muddy, swirling currents of the Missouri River. The current was so strong that the men often had to jump into the freezing water to drag the heavy boats forward by hand. They were heading directly into a wild, unforgiving frontier that awaited them. In the spring of 1803, Meriwether Lewis arrived at the Federal Arsenal in Harper's Ferry with a secret shopping list from the president himself. The young captain needed to outfit an expedition that would face the absolute unknown. He spent weeks working alongside master gunsmiths to modify 15 standard U.S. Army rifles. These weapons had to be shorter, lighter, and completely reliable in the wilderness. He also secured tons of gunpowder, lead, native native chiefs. But the most unusual weapon in his arsenal was a silent experimental air rifle designed by an Austrian inventor. With no smoke and no loud report, this high-tech weapon could fire 40 steel balls with terrifying precision. Louis knew this silent rifle would serve as a crucial psychological weapon to awe anyone who dared challenge them. After packing his gear into heavy wooden crates, Louis headed to Pittsburgh to oversee the construction of his keelboat. The boat was 55 feet of solid oak, designed to carry but the boat builder was a notorious drunk who constantly missed his deadlines. Every single day of delay pushed the expedition closer to the deadly clutches of a Rocky Mountain winter. Louis paced the muddy riverbanks of the Ohio River, writing furious letters to President Thomas Jefferson about the delays. By the time the keelboat was finally pushed into the water on August 31st, the river levels had plummeted. The heavy boat scraped against the rocky bottom, forcing the men to literally drag the massive vessel over sandbars. But Louis was not traveling alone on these shallow waters. At his side was a massive 150-pound black Newfoundland dog named Seaman. Louis had purchased the dog for $20, a massive sum at the time, to act as a sentry and retriever. As the boat drifted down the Ohio River, Louis made a crucial stop in Louisville, Kentucky. Waiting on the shoreline was the man who would share the burden of this impossible journey. William Clark, master cartographer. When the two men shook hands on the muddy banks of the Ohio, the Corps of Discovery was truly born. They immediately began recruiting the toughest men they could find in the Ohio Valley. They did not want polished soldiers. They wanted rugged woodsmen, expert hunters, and survivalists. They selected the famous 9 young men from Kentucky, renowned for their wilderness skills. Among the recruits was Clark's personal slave, a tall, incredibly strong man named York. York was a skilled hunter and swimmer, whose presence would soon shock the native tribes they encountered. Another critical recruit was George Drouillard, a brilliant half-French, half-Shawnee scout and interpreter. Drouillard could track animals across bare rock and speak the universal sign language of the plains. With the core group assembled, they pushed further west toward the Mississippi River. They established a winter camp at Camp Dubois, on the Illinois side of the river, directly opposite the mouth of the Missouri. Throughout the freezing winter of 1803, Clark drilled the men into a cohesive military unit. The men chopped wood, built log cabins, and practiced marksmanship in the biting cold. Meanwhile, Louis spent his time in St. Louis, gathering maps and intelligence from Spanish and French fur traders. He learned of massive grizzly bears that could survive multiple gunshot wounds. The traders warned him of powerful native nations who controlled the river and did not want white men passing through. But the political landscape was shifting beneath their feet, even as they prepared to launch. In March 1804, Louis attended the official ceremony in St. Louis, where the flag of Spain was lowered and the French flag was raised. Only 24 hours later, the French flag was lowered to make way for the Stars and Stripes. The vast territory of Louisiana was now officially American soil, and the gateway. Spring rains had swollen the Missouri River, making it deep enough for their heavily loaded keelboat. The men loaded the final crates of dried meat, whiskey, instruments, and trading goods onto the boats. On May 14, 1804, under a gray, drizzling sky, Clark ordered the men to cast off from Camp Dubois. Louis, finishing last-minute business in St. Louis, would catch up with them a few days later downriver. The expedition consisted of 3 boats, the Grand Keelboat and 2 smaller flat-bottomed pirogues. As the oars splashed into the brown, muddy water of the Missouri, they were heading into a blank space on the map, facing a wilderness that had swallowed every other explorer before them. But as the heavily laden boats pushed against the ferocious, muddy current of the Missouri, they had no idea that the greatest threat to their survival was already waiting for them, just past the horizon. On May 14, 1804, 45 men pushed off from the banks of the Mississippi River and steered their boats into the muddy, churning waters of the Missouri. This was the Corps of Discovery, embarking on a voyage into a vast wilderness that no American mapmaker had ever charted. At the center of their small fleet was a massive 55-foot keelboat, fitted with 22. Alongside it swam two smaller, flat-bottomed wooden boats called pirogues. The men were headed upstream, directly against the brutal, unpredictable current of the Missouri River. Under the command of Meriwether Lewis and William Clark, the expedition had to haul tons of supplies against a river that seemed actively hostile. The Missouri was choked with massive sunken trees called sawyers, which hid just beneath the muddy surface. These jagged logs could easily rip the bottom out of a wooden boat in a matter of seconds. To make matters worse, the riverbanks were constantly collapsing, sending tons of earth crashing into the water with a sound like thunder. On some days, the wind blew so fiercely against them that sailing was completely impossible. The men had to jump into the chest-deep water, sinking into thick, sticky mud up to their waists. They harnessed themselves to heavy ropes and physically dragged the massive keelboat upstream from the shore. Their feet were cut by sharp rocks and bitten by swarms of leeches hiding in the shallows. The heat of the Missouri as they worked. Swarms of mosquitoes and gnats descended upon the crew in thick, dark clouds. The insects were so thick that the men could barely breathe without swallowing them. Their skin was soon covered in painful, infected bites, and many contracted high fevers. Despite the physical torture, the expedition pressed forward, mapping every bend of the river. Carefully calculating their speed and distance. Meriwether Lewis spent much of his time on shore, walking the rugged banks with his massive Newfoundland dog, Seaman. Lewis collected samples of plants and animals that no American scientist had ever seen before. He took detailed notes on the strange prairie dogs, which the men called barking squirrels. But the physical toll of the journey was beginning to show on the men of the Corps. By July, the water of the severe dysentery among the crew. They suffered from heat stroke, boils, and extreme exhaustion from pulling the heavy boats for 12 hours a day. On August 19, 1804, Sergeant Charles Floyd, one of the youngest and most promising members of the expedition, fell gravely ill. He complained of severe abdominal pains that grew worse with every passing hour. The commanders did everything they could to comfort him, but medical knowledge in 1804 was primitive. His condition rapidly deteriorated. The next day, on August 20th, Sergeant Charles Floyd drew his last breath. He would be the only member of the Corps of Discovery to die during the entire 2.5-year journey. The grieving men buried him on a high bluff overlooking the river, naming the spot Floyd's Bluff. They fired a salute over his grave, wiped away their tears, and immediately got back into their boats. There was no time to mourn, because they were entering territory controlled by powerful native nations. President Thomas Jefferson had specifically warned them about one tribe in particular. The Lakota Sioux controlled the trade along this stretch of the river, and they did not tolerate trespassers. As the expedition pushed deeper into the northern plains, the scouts spotted smoke signals rising from the distant hills. The men gripped their rifles tightly, knowing that a single mistake could end their journey before it truly began. And very soon the shadow of a massive Lakota warrior party appeared on the horizon. By October of 1804, the brutal northern winter was fast approaching the Great Plains. Meriwether Lewis and William Clark knew their expedition would die in the open cold if they did not find shelter immediately. They chose a spot on the banks of the Missouri River, in what is now North Dakota, right near the villages of the Mandan and Hidatsa nations. Here, the explorers built a rugged, triangular stronghold they named Fort Mandan. The walls were made of thick cottonwood logs, designed to keep out both the howling winds. The temperature plummeted to a terrifying 40 degrees below zero. Inside, the men of the Corps of Discovery huddled around fireplaces, their breath freezing into frost on the wooden walls. But the cold was not their only challenge. Survival depended entirely on the neighbors they had just met. The Mandan people lived in massive, insulated earth lodges that kept them warm through the deadliest winters. Unlike the hostile encounters the expedition had faced downriver, the Mandan welcomed precious corn and buffalo meat for metal tools, beads, and iron axes. Without this crucial trade, Lewis and Clark's historic journey would have ended right there, frozen in the Dakota dirt. As the weeks dragged on, The fort became a bustling hub of winter survival and planning. It was during these dark, freezing months that a man walked into the fort who would change the course of American history. His name was Toussaint Charbonneau, a French-Canadian fur trapper who lived among the Hidatsa. Charbonneau offered his services as an interpreter, but he did not come alone. By his side was one of his wives, a teenage Shoshone girl named Sacagawea. Sacagawea had been kidnapped years earlier by a Hidatsa raiding party from her homeland in the Rocky Mountains. She was thousands of miles from her people, pregnant and living as a captive's wife. But Lewis and Clark immediately saw her true value to their mission. They did not just need Charbonneau's French, they desperately needed Sacagawea's knowledge of the Shoshone language and the mountain passes ahead. If they wanted to cross the formidable Rocky Mountains, they would need to buy horses from the Shoshone. Sacagawea was their only key to unlocking that hostile, towering barrier. In February of 1805, inside the freezing walls of Fort Mandan, Sacagawea went into labor. The birth was slow, painful, and highly dangerous for the young mother. To speed up the labor, a fur trapper gave Sacagawea a traditional potion made from the crushed or medicine. Just moments after drinking the mixture, she gave birth to a healthy baby boy. They named him Jean-Baptiste Charbonneau, but Clark affectionately nicknamed the infant Pomp. Now, the expedition had a teenage mother and a newborn baby added to their rugged military unit. To many, this seemed like a recipe for disaster on a treacherous wilderness trek. But Lewis and Clark realized that a woman and a baby would be the ultimate shield for their journey. In the eyes of the Native American tribes they would encounter, a war party never traveled with a mother and child. Sacagawea's presence was a silent, powerful declaration of peace. While winter raged, Lewis spent his days writing detailed reports on the plants, animals, and geography they had cataloged so far. Clark painstakingly drew maps of the upper Missouri, relying on information carved into the dirt by Mandan chiefs. Outside, the ice on the river began to crack and groan like thunder. By April, the Missouri River was free of ice, and the path to the Pacific was open once again. The expedition prepared to split into two groups. One group would take a barge back downriver to St. Louis, carrying Lewis's journals, maps, and preserved plant specimens for President Thomas Jefferson. The other group, consisting of 33 people, would push forward into the uncharted West. On April 7, 1805, they loaded their dugout canoes and set off against the river's current once more. Among them was Sacagawea, carrying little Jean-Baptiste on her back. They were leaving the safety of Fort Mandan and heading into a territory where no white man had ever trod. They felt invincible, but they had no idea of the terrifying natural wonders and deadly traps that lay directly in their path. By June of 1805, Meriwether Lewis and William Clark believed the hardest part of their journey was behind them, but the Missouri River was about to throw a massive wall of water directly in their path. For days, a distant rumbling grew louder and louder, sounding like constant thunder under a clear blue sky. On June 13, Meriwether Lewis hiked ahead of the main group and saw it with his own eyes. The Great Falls of the Missouri. It was a breathtaking sight, a massive cascade of rushing water stretching across the river. But for a river expedition, this beautiful sight was an absolute nightmare. The water dropped 80. There was no way to row through this, and there was no way to pull the heavy wooden boats upstream. To survive, they had to bypass the falls by carrying everything they owned overland. They estimated the detour would take a day or two, covering a few miles. They were terribly, terribly wrong. The detour turned out to be an 18-mile trek through some of the most brutal terrain. Pear cactus that pierced right through their thin leather moccasins. Every step was agony, leaving a trail of blood in the dirt. To make matters worse, the ground was uneven, baked hard by the sun, and littered with sharp rocks. The men had to build crude wooden wagons using the trunks of cottonwood trees just to roll their heavy canoes. They harnessed themselves to these heavy, clumsy wagons like beasts of burden. Sudden, violent hailstorms battered them from above, bruising their skin and freezing their fingers. Grizzly bears stalked them through the brush, forcing the men to keep their rifles loaded at all times. For nearly a month, the men pushed, pulled and bled across the Montana plains. By early July, they finally bypassed the last of the 5 waterfalls. They were exhausted, bruised, and weeks behind schedule, but they had made it. They left their heaviest wooden boats behind at the bottom of the falls to save weight. They desperately needed new boats to carry their massive load of supplies up the shallow river. But Meriwether Lewis had a secret weapon that he believed would solve this entire problem. Back in Pittsburgh, before the journey even began, he had designed a custom. It was a collapsible iron skeleton, weighing only 99 pounds, designed to be easily carried over land. Once assembled, it was supposed to be covered in animal hides, making a strong, lightweight canoe. Lewis was incredibly proud of this invention and had carried the heavy iron pieces for thousands of miles. On July 2nd, 1805, the men set up camp and began assembling the iron monster. They put the iron pieces together and wrapped the frame in 28 elk skins and 20 buffalo hides. But as they began to sew the skins together, they realized they had a fatal problem. They had no pine tar to seal the seams and make the boat waterproof. In the deep wilderness of Montana, there were no pine trees to be found for miles. Lewis refused to give up on his precious invention. He decided to improvise a sealant using a mixture of beeswax, buffalo tallow, and charcoal. They smeared the thick, smelly paste over the leather seams, hoping it would hold. The boat looked strange, like a giant black coffin floating on the water. On July 9th, they launched the iron boat into the Missouri River. At first it worked beautifully, sitting high and dry on the water's surface. Lewis was triumphant, believing his genius design had saved the expedition. But the triumph lasted only a few minutes. As the makeshift wax sealant cooled in the water, it began to crack and peel away. The cold river water dissolved the fat, and the seams began to split. Water poured into the vessel, and the heavy iron frame began to drag it straight to the bottom. The men scrambled to pull the sinking boat back to the shore before all their gear was ruined. Lewis was devastated as his prized invention lay ruined and useless on the muddy riverbank. They had wasted precious weeks of summer on a failed experiment. They had no choice but to tear the iron frame apart and bury it in the dirt. With winter fast approaching and the Rocky Mountains looming in the distance, they were now completely stranded without enough boats. But as they scrambled to build crude dugout canoes from hollowed-out trees, a new and much greater threat was quietly watching them from the shadows. By August of 1805, the Corps of Discovery was running out of time and running out of river. The towering snow-capped peaks of the Rocky Mountains loomed ahead like a giant stone wall. The Missouri River, which had been their highway for over a year, had shrunk to a shallow, icy creek. Their canoes were scraping against the rocky bottom, completely useless for crossing the massive mountains. If they could not find horses, the men were exhausted, their feet were bleeding through worn-out moccasins, and winter was fast approaching. Everything depended on finding the Shoshone Indians, a tribe rumored to possess vast herds of horses. But the mountains seemed completely empty, offering only endless pine trees and freezing winds. Meriwether Lewis decided he could not wait any longer in the slow-moving boats. He took 3 men, packed light, and set out on foot. They climbed higher and higher, the air growing thinner with every painful step. On August 12th, Lewis reached what he believed was the ultimate boundary of the civilized world. It was the Continental Divide, located at Lemhi Pass on the modern border of Montana and Idaho. Here, Lewis bed down and drank from the cold, bubbling headwaters of the mighty Missouri River. He expected to look down the other side of the ridge and see a great sloping plain leading directly to the Pacific Ocean. Instead, he saw a terrifying sight. As far as the eye could see, there were only more mountains, massive, jagged, and covered in snow. There was no easy water route to the sea, only a brutal, endless maze of stone. The realization was crushing, but Lewis had no time to despair. He pressed onward down the western slope, desperately searching for any sign of human life. Suddenly, through his spyglass, Lewis spotted a lone Native American man on horseback. Lewis waved his blanket and shouted the Shoshone word for friend, Tab Babone. But the lone rider was suspicious fearing an ambush by a hostile tribe. He turned his horse around and vanished into the thick brush. Louis was devastated, knowing he had just watched their best chance marching, tracking the horse's hoofprints through the dust. 2 days later, they suddenly rounded a bend and came face to face with 3 Shoshone women. The women were terrified, convinced these strange pale men were going to kill them. They sat on the ground and bowed their heads, waiting for the fatal blow. Louis immediately dropped his rifle, walked forward, and gently took one of the women by the hand, which he had kept covered to protect it from the blistering sun. He gave them gifts of bright blue beads, small mirrors, and pewter paint. The women realized these strangers meant no harm and agreed to lead them to their village. Soon, a group of 60 heavily armed Shoshone warriors on horseback came riding toward them at full speed. Louis did not run. He laid down his gun and walked forward holding the American flag. The chief of the tribe, a young man named Cameawait, dismounted his horse and embraced Louis warmly. The Shoshones welcomed the exhausted explorers into their camp, sharing what little food they had. But the language barrier made negotiations for horses almost impossible. Louis could speak English, his scout Labiche spoke French, and another man spoke Hidatsa. They needed Sacagawea, who was still traveling up the river with William, sent a runner back to guide Clark's group to the Shoshone camp immediately. On August 17th, Clark and the main party finally arrived at the village. Sacagawea was called into the chief's tent to serve as the crucial translator. She sat down, looked at Chief Cameawait, and suddenly froze in absolute shock. Tears began to stream down her face as she looked closer at the young chief. She rushed forward, threw her blanket over him, and embraced him, weeping hysterically. By an unbelievable stroke of historic coincidence, Chief Cameawait was Sacagawea's long-lost brother. They had been separated 5 years earlier when she was kidnapped by a rival tribe. The emotional reunion changed everything for the desperate expedition. Cameawait promised to help his sister and her new companions in any way he could. The Shoshones agreed to trade nearly 30 strong horses for guns, knives, and metal kettles. They also provided a guide, an old Shoshone man the explorers named Old Toby. Old Toby knew the hidden, treacherous mountain trails better than anyone alive. With horses packed and a guide leading the way, the Corps of Discovery prepared to face the mountains. But they had no idea that again. By September 1805, the Corps of Discovery was staring directly into the jaws of death. The Shoshone horses they had fought so hard to acquire were now their only hope of survival. Ahead of them lay the Lolo Trail, a treacherous, narrow path cutting through the Bitterroot Mountains of Idaho. Their Shoshone guide, an old man they called Toby, warned them that this crossing would be brutal. But Meriwether Lewis and William Clark had no choice but to push forward into the clouds. On September 11th, the first heavy snowstorm hit the peaks, erasing the trail beneath their feet. The temperature plummeted far below freezing, turning their damp leather clothes into stiff sheets of ice. The mountain paths were so steep and slick that baggage horses lost their footing and tumbled down the rocky cliffs. Each crash meant the loss of precious supplies they could never replace. Soon, the dense forest choked out all sunlight, leaving the men in a freezing, shadowy labyrinth. There were no deer, no elk, and no birds in this frozen wasteland. The silence of the mountains was absolute, broken only by the sound of coughing men and stumbling hooves. By the 5th day on the trail, the expedition's food supplies were entirely gone. Starvation forced them to make a desperate, heartbreaking choice. They killed one of their precious pack horses just to keep their hearts beating. They boiled the meat, washed it down with melted snow, and kept walking. But a single horse does not feed dozens of starving, physically exhausted men for long. The next day, they killed another horse, and then another. William Clark wrote in his journal that the men were growing weaker by the hour, their eyes sunken and their limbs trembling. To make matters worse, Old Toby lost the trail in a blinding flurry of white. They were trapped in a frozen maze, miles from civilization, with no idea which way was out. Every step through the waist-deep snow felt like lead, and frostbite began to blacken their toes. Desperate to save his men, Clark took a small advance party of the strongest hunters, and forged ahead. He hoped to find the end of the mountains and bring back food before the main group collapsed and died. On September 20th, as Clark's scouts stumbled out of the dense timber into a wide, sunlit prairie, they saw signs of life. Emerging from the tree line, they encountered 3 young Native American boys who ran away in terror. Clark followed them slowly, holding his hands up to show he carried no weapons. The boys led them to a village of the Nez Perce Nation, located on the Waipi Prairie. The Nez Perce had never seen white men before, and their appearance was terrifying. The explorers were skeletal, filthy, covered in sores, and wrapped in rotting animal. Chiefs debated whether they should kill the mysterious intruders. A powerful warrior chief named Twisted Hair watched the desperate strangers with deep suspicion. But an elderly Nez Perce woman named Watkues, who had once been captured by enemy tribes and treated kindly by white traders, spoke up. She told her people to do no harm to these strangers, whispering, "Let them be, they are my friends." The Nez Perce chose mercy and welcomed the dying explorers into their camp. They offered Clark's men a feast of buffalo meat. The starving men tore into the food with animalistic hunger, devouring everything in sight. But their shrunken, empty stomachs could not handle the sudden richness of the Nez Perce diet. Within hours, nearly every member of the advance party was violently ill, vomiting and incapacitated. When Meriwether Lewis and the rest of the starving main party finally staggered out of the mountains, they found their comrades helpless. Now, the entire Corps of Discovery lay sick and defenseless in the camp of a powerful, armed tribe they barely knew. But the Nez Perce did not take advantage of their vulnerability. Instead, they nursed the white men back to health. As the men recovered, Twisted Hair showed them how to log giant pine trees using fire to hollow out the trunks. In a matter of weeks, the expedition had built 5 brand-new, dugout canoes, ready for the water. They branded their remaining horses and left them in the trusted care of Twisted Hair until their return. On October 7th, new canoes into the rushing waters of the Clearwater River. For the first time in over a year, they would be traveling with the current, rushing toward the Pacific Ocean. But the wild rivers of the West held dangers far more violent than the frozen peaks they had just escaped. After starving on the Lolo Trail, the men of the Corps of Discovery finally felt the warmth of a new river beneath their canoes. They were now riding the swift currents of the Clearwater River, which quickly merged into the massive Snake River. Every mile carried them closer to their ultimate goal, but the waters were growing increasingly violent. Chief Twisted Hair of the Nez Perce had warned them of the great falls ahead, but Meriwether Lewis and William Clark had no choice but to press forward. By mid-October of 1805, the air turned cold and damp as they entered the mighty Columbia River. This was the legendary River of the West, a massive highway of water, cutting through towering basalt cliffs. The landscape changed from dry, barren plains to dense, moss-draped forests of giant Douglas firs. But the river was not a smooth ride. It was a series of deadly traps. At a place called the Celilo Falls, the Columbia River narrowed into a roaring choke point of churning foam. Local tribes watched from the cliffs, expecting the white men to portage their heavy wooden canoes around the chaos. Instead, William Clark looked at the roaring rapids and decided to run them head-on. With incredible skill and pure luck, the explorers shot through the boiling waters of the short narrows without losing a single man. The watching Native Americans were stunned, realizing these travelers possessed an almost suicidal bravery. As they paddled further west, the air began to smell different. It was salty, thick, and heavy with coastal fog. The men also noticed the local Chinook Indians wore European-made cloth and possessed brass kettles. This was proof that they were finally nearing the Pacific trade routes. But the Pacific Northwest was about to show them its darkest, most brutal weather. In early November, a violent storm trapped the expedition on a narrow, rocky shoreline. For 6 agonizing days, relentless rain poured down, soaking them to the bone. The tide rose so high that it floated their heavy canoes. Their leather clothing literally began to rot off their backs in the constant moisture. They were trapped on a strip of land so narrow they could not even pitch their tents. They had to cling to the wet rocks, shivering in the cold, eating nothing but dried fish. William Clark wrote in his journal that their situation was truly disagreeable. On November 7, 1805, the fog suddenly mist. Clark saw a vast, endless blue horizon stretching out before them. He scribbled the famous words in his diary, "Ocean in view, oh the joy." But the celebration was premature. They were actually still in the massive mouth of the Columbia River estuary, not the open ocean itself. Sometimes rising 15 feet high. For another week, the rain and wind battered their makeshift camp on the North Shore. The men were exhausted, sick, and desperately needed a permanent winter shelter. Lewis and Clark realized the north side of the river offered no protection from the fierce winter storms. They needed to find a better spot on the south side, but crossing the 5-mile-wide estuary in stormy weather was deadly. To solve this, Lewis and Clark did something unprecedented for the United States military. They held a democratic vote to decide where to build their winter camp. Every member of the expedition was given an equal vote. This included York, Clark's enslaved African-American servant. It also included Sacagawea, the young Shoshone mother. This was likely the first time in American history alongside white men. The majority voted to cross the river to the south side, near modern-day Astoria, Oregon. There, they began hacking down massive pine trees to build Fort Clatsop. They finished the fort just before Christmas, securing a roof over their heads as the winter rains set in. They had successfully traveled over 4,000 miles across an uncharted continent to reach the Pacific. But as the cold rain pounded the roof of Fort Clatsop, a grim realization began to settle over the men. Now they had to survive the winter and find a way back home. The men of the Corps of Discovery had finally reached the edge of the continent, but there was no triumph in their victories. They stood on the cold, wind-blasted shores of the Pacific Ocean, exhausted, starving, and soaked to the bone. The relentless Pacific storms battered their temporary camp, shredding their remaining tents into useless rags. To survive the brutal winter ahead, Meriwether Lewis and William Clark knew they needed a permanent shelter immediately. They held a historic vote, allowing every member of the expedition, including the enslaved man York and the Native American woman Sacagawea, to voice their opinion on where to build. The vote was unanimous to cross to the south side of the Columbia River, in what is now modern-day Oregon, where game was rumored to be more plentiful. On a small, forested hill near the Untold River, they began hacking down massive ancient Douglas fir trees. With raw, blistered hands, the men dragged the heavy logs through thick, freezing mud to construct a crude. They had completed Fort Clatsop, a small, damp stronghold named after the local Clatsop Nation. They celebrated the holiday with a meager feast of spoiled elk meat, parched root bread, and a few remaining drops of polluted water. But the completion of the fort brought no comfort, as the rain simply refused to stop. For the next 112 days, it rained almost every single day, turning the fort into a swamp of misery. The constant moisture rotted their leather clothing right off their backs. Men sat shivering in damp wooden rooms, desperately sewing together rough elk hides to make makeshift shirts and trousers. The dampness bred a plague of fleas that infested their bedding, their clothes, and their hair, making sleep nearly impossible. Almost every member of the party suffered from painful rheumatism, high fevers, and severe stomach ailments. Their main source of survival was the local elk population, but preserving the meat in the humid, wet air was an impossible task. Within hours of a kill, mold. To prevent starvation, Clark established a salt-making camp on the nearby ocean shore. 3 men spent weeks boiling gallons of seawater in large iron kettles over roaring fires to extract precious salt. This salt was the only thing that kept their decaying elk meat edible and saved them from slow starvation. While the men struggled to survive, Lewis and Clark spent their dark, freezing days inside the fort, writing in their journals. They documented new species of plants and animals they had encountered. They sketched detailed maps of the rugged Pacific Northwest coastline, filling in the blank spaces of the American continent. But as the winter dragged on into March of 1806, the expedition was running dangerously low on trade goods. They had nearly exhausted their supply of blue beads and brass buttons, which they used to trade with the local tribes for food. Without these goods, they could no longer secure the vital canoe transport or the dog meat they relied on for nutrition. The men grew increasingly desperate. They knew that the journey back across the towering snow-covered Rocky Mountains would be even more treacherous than the journey west. Every day spent trapped in the rotting fort was a day closer to running out of resources entirely. On March 23, 1806, the sky cleared just enough for them to load their canoes and officially abandon Fort Clatsop forever. They turned their faces east, ready to face the thousands of miles of wilderness that lay between them and home. But as they pushed their canoes into the rushing currents of the Columbia River, a terrifying realization began to settle over the captains. The mountains ahead were still buried under 15 feet of solid ice, and the most dangerous leg of their journey was about to begin. By March of 1806, the damp walls of Fort Clatsop had become a prison of rot and misery. The Pacific rain had decayed their clothes, ruined their remaining meat, and infested their blankets with fleas. Meriwether Lewis and William Clark knew they could not survive another season on the Oregon coast. On March 23rd, they turned the 3,000-mile journey home, but the return journey would not be a simple retracing of their steps. Once they crossed the formidable Bitterroot Mountains, Lewis made a daring and dangerous decision. He decided to split the expedition into two separate groups to map uncharted territories. William Clark would take one group south to explore the Yellowstone River. Lewis would take a small party north of Blackfeet Nation territory. On July 16, 1806, Lewis set out with only 3 men, George Drouillard and the brothers Joseph and Reuben Field. They rode into the vast, windswept plains of present-day Montana, knowing they were outnumbered. The Blackfeet were known as fierce protectors of their ancestral hunting grounds. For days, Lewis scanned the horizon through his brass telescope, searching for any sign of smoke. On July 26th, near the banks of the Marias River, his worst fears were realized. Looking down from a high ridge, Lewis spotted 8 young Blackfeet warriors riding toward them. The warriors were heavily armed, and their eyes were fixed on the explorers' horses and rifles. Lewis knew that running would trigger a deadly chase. Instead, he raised his hand in a gesture of peace and rode slowly down the hill to meet them. Through sign language, the two groups agreed to camp together for the night near a grove of cottonwood trees. They shared a meal of bison meat, and Lewis explained their mission of peace and trade. But the tension in the camp was thick enough to cut with a knife. Lewis took the first watch, staying awake until the early hours of the morning before waking Joseph Field. As the cold dawn broke on July 27th, the fragility of their peace shattered in an instant. The Blackfeet warriors silently rose and grabbed the sleeping explorers, a warrior running off with his and his brother's guns. With a burst of adrenaline, Joseph and Reuben Field chased the warrior down the riverbank. A desperate struggle ensued, and Reuben Field plunged his hunting knife directly into the warrior's heart. At the same moment, Lewis woke to the sound of George Drouillard shouting in alarm. Lewis saw another warrior running away with his prized horse and his rifle. Without hesitation, Lewis drew his pistol and chased the man across the rocky plains. He screamed for the warrior to drop the gun, but the man turned and pointed it directly at Lewis. Lewis fired first, striking the warrior in the abdomen. The wounded warrior fell to the ground, but managed to fire one shot back that whizzed past Lewis's ear. Realizing the rest of the Blackfeet tribe would soon seek bloody revenge, Lewis ordered his men to flee immediately. They abandoned their heavy south without stopping. They covered an astonishing 120 miles in less than 24 hours. Their horses were foaming at the mouth and collapsing from exhaustion when they finally reached the Missouri River. By a stroke of absolute luck, they met Clark's group drifting down the river on canoes at that exact moment. The reunited expedition paddled furiously downriver, leaving the hostile territory behind them forever. This violent clash would mark the first and only time the expedition shed human blood. It also sowed the seeds of a deep, decades-long hostility between the Blackfeet Nation and American fur trappers. By September of 1806, the expedition finally neared the outskirts of St. Louis. The people of America had long since given them up for dead. But as the canoes rounded the bend of the Mississippi River, the entire nation was about to receive the shock of a lifetime.